Thank you, Sergey. Good morning. Thank you for all coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. In particular, I would like to thank Sergey Ibliev for his invitation. I'll go through two interrelated but slightly different emphasis on financial networks. So these are with my PhD students. They're both at Simon Fraser University. The first one. So the first one is basically how do we account for, how do we model counterparty risk, credit risk. Counterparty risk is a latent variable. It's not an observable variable. So we are facing a type of situation where we wish to account for counterparty risk. Counterparty risk is important in terms of corporate risk. Corporate risk is, of course, important in terms of corporate defaults. We wish to model, we wish to understand counterparty risk, but at the same time, counterparty risk is not observable. Because it's not observable, we may have to build a proxy. So how do we build a proxy for counterparty risk, such that this proxy is a reliable proxy and a robust proxy? So what this paper does is that it uses information on firms. So we can think of that these are the firms in the United States, in the S&P 500. These are the largest publicly traded firms in the United States, and these firms sit in a supplier-customer chain. So some of them are suppliers, some of them are customers. Customers themselves may be supplying to others. You can think of that these firms carry out business with each other. As they carry business with each other, if we can somehow identify the nature of the business, if we can somehow quantify the nature of the relationship, then perhaps we can use this information towards building proxies for counterparty risk. And somehow this is feasible to do it from the data because according to the accounting regulations, those suppliers have to report those customers who constitute at least 10% of their business. So if you have a large customer, then you have to report who these customers are to the accounting agency. So this gives us, this will give us some way of quantifying, some way of identifying the relationship between these firms. So let me reiterate the problem one more time, because this is basically the punchline. We are trying to measure a relationship. We are trying to understand a relationship. But part of this relationship is not observed. Because it's not observed, when it's not observed, we say that it's a latent variable. Because it's a latent variable, somehow I have to build a proxy for it. Financial networks, in this particular context, it's going to be the supplier-customer network. The utilization of the information from the supplier-customer network is going to give me enough framework to measure, to construct a proxy for the counterparty risk. So what happens is that, so when we do this, what happens is that typically when we model the counterparty risk, let's say that we model the counterparty risk through credit spreads. In the modeling of credit spreads, there are two main drivers. One driver may be the leverage, and the other driver may be the jump risk. So then, given that these firms sit in a supplier-customer network, then on the left-hand side we have the credit spread. On the right-hand side, as explanatory variables, we have the jump risk and the leverage as variables for the supplier. What this paper shows is that it is true that the jump risk and the leverage of a supplier is important variables in terms of explaining the behavior of the credit spread. But on top of it, the leverage and the jump risk of the largest customers of those suppliers are also significant in terms of explaining the relationship. And those customers are captured through this financial network. What may be the nature of the relationship? Like, what are the ways in which this may propagate? In terms of, when we say encode risk, what is the nature of this risk and how will it propagate? Well, one perhaps is the trade credit exposure. Trade credit exposure typically happens when payment, for instance, is not on delivery. Two firms are working with each other. Perhaps an example is, you have Apple. Apple is working with Foxconn, and Foxconn is manufacturing the iPhones for Apple. But Apple has to pay Foxconn before production or before delivery. So then the lender is going to take a credit exposure, and if the size of the credit and the credit worthiness of the borrower is going to determine the vulnerability of this relationship. So there is a channel in a supplier-customer network which takes in the form of the trade credit exposure, where two firms or multiple firms takes exposure from one another through the production process. The other one is the future cash flow risk. Future cash flow risk often operates through, for instance, Apple may share some certain type of technological information with Foxconn, and Foxconn may invest in a customer-specific equipment. You can only use that equipment to make the iPhone, but not others. So, in the case of the future cash flow risk, they are invested in each other's businesses in terms of knowledge, in terms of equipment. They have mutual interest to survive. But if things don't work out, then they may have to go together. So what we find is that let's do this in terms of leverage. If there is one standard deviation increase in the leverage of a customer, that leads into about 26 basis points in the widening of the credit spread. On the other hand, if there is a one standard deviation increase in the leverage of the supplier itself, that leads into about 50 basis points in the widening of the credit spread. So the customer is almost half of the half of importance in terms of the widening of the credit spread, meaning that these type of interdependent type of relationships are quite important in capturing and refining the credit risk modeling. Let me go and explain the nature of the model a bit. There are two types of issues here. One is the formation, the other one is the analysis. This is mostly an analysis. So let's assume that there are 5 firms. These 5 firms sit in a network. So what you're seeing here is that, for instance, firm number 2 is supplying to firm number 4, and firm number 2 also supplying into number 1. But number 1 itself is not feeding into any other firm. So in that sense, so it goes from to 2. The first row is the first firm. The first firm is not feeding into any other firm, so therefore the first row is 0, because the first firm doesn't have any arrows originating from itself. The second firm is feeding into the first. Second row is the second firm, and then the second firm is feeding into the fourth. So when we have a set of relationships, so this is a cross-sectional type of relationship. Typically, when we learn the cross-sectional models, the panel structure, most of the time the relationship is in a bivariate setting, but here we have a rather complex cross-sectional structure. That cross-sectional structure can always be summarized in the form of a matrix. That matrix is called the adjacency matrix. In this case, there are only 5 firms, but in the paper we have about 5,000 firms. If you have 5,000 firms, and then the matrix is 5,000 by 5,000, it'll look like a very complicated chart. But regardless how complicated it is, we can always quantify the nature of that relationship through the adjacency matrix. The weights don't have to be 0s and 1s. The weights can be, you can put certain type of weights which is relevant to the analysis. So this matrix is the uppercase G. Uppercase G is the adjacency matrix. The lowercase g is the network. Sometimes we call it a network, sometimes we call it a graph. So if we have an adjacency matrix of a network, then we can take that matrix, apply it through certain characteristics. These characteristics would be, in our case, the customer characteristics. For instance, the jump, implied volatility, the leverage of the customers of a supplier. Then this would give us the characteristics of those neighbors a particular individual would faces. In our case, it would give us the customer's characteristics of a supplier would face. What are the nature of the characteristics of my customers? If I have so many customers, and if I weight out these customers according to a certain weighting structure, how do those customer characteristics come into play? And you can weigh them. If you weigh them, then we say that the adjacency matrix is stochastic. So here's another example where we have 4 firms. These 4 firms are in a relationship with each other. And for instance, the first one is feeding into the second, the first one is feeding into the third, and this is, first row is the first individual or the first firm. Because it's feeding into the second and the third, it takes a weight of 1, otherwise 0. So this is the adjacency matrix. We take the adjacency matrix, apply it to a certain exogenous characteristic. This may be the leverage of those customers, this may be the implied volatility of those customers. Then, when you apply that, then if that particular supplier would face this type of factor structure. We can think of this as a factor. And that factor is going to be very firm specific. Some firms will receive weights of, let's say, second and the third, and some of them will receive no weights. So this is a very boutique-y, very localized type of digging out, learning about the nature of the characteristics, weighted average of the characteristics of my customers. If you're in a, let's say, if this was a set of banks, and these set of banks are borrowing and lending from each other in the overnight market, then you are analyzing a given bank, then this would give you the type of banks that you are borrowing and lending, and how do they affect you in this relationship. So, as I indicated earlier, the relationship doesn't have to be first order of importance. The relationship can be higher of importance. So, I may have a customer, but that customer may have its own customers. So there may be, the effect of a customer in a supply chain would rely on the second order, third order, fourth order importance. So if you go back to this G, the G, or we look at this one, so this G, adjacency matrix, approximates or calculates the first order of importance of relationship. But if I'm interested in the second order, third order of importance, then I would raise the matrix G to the powers, higher powers. G to the power 2 would give me the second order. G to the power J would give me the J order of importance. So from there, we construct the model. We name the model to be the network autoregressive moving average. So G to the power I is the adjacency matrix raised to the power I. So this tells us the degree of relationship, the ith order relation, up to ith order relationship. P is a parameter that you have to choose in your environment. Y is, in our case, is the credit spread. These would be the credit spread of my customers. So this is more like an autoregressive scheme in a network setting. Of course, Y's are indexed with I, but also T. So there is a panel structure here. This would be the MA part because the adjacency matrix takes the exogenous characteristics into account. So this is it's a parametric model. It's a very simple. The parameters enter into linearly. You can think of this as a panel structure. That panel structure takes those cross-sectional relationships into account.
The index of betas is Q or J?
J. Okay, so this part I will skip quickly. There is, I think, 7 or 8 different types of data sets that we had to go through to construct the data here. So there's a lot of work here to build the data. But let me summarize how this looks in our setting. In our setting, we are trying to model the credit spread of a particular supplier. So we call that supplier the firm. The firm has a set of characteristics. These are the leverage, implied volatility, and jump. We calculate them in a certain way, which I will show you. And then we have customers coming in. These customers are approximated through the network. So G is the adjacency matrix. So you apply that to the leverage of a customer, implied volatility and jump. Of course, G is changing over time. So because the reporting, when firms report their largest customers every quarter, some firms go bankrupt and the new firms are coming in. So the nature of the network changes. So you take that into account by some calculation of the G, say every 6 months or every year. But this is what it is, that this is the supplier characteristics, these are the customer characteristics. Customer characteristics are coming through this network. How do we calculate G? Well, in our case, G is calculated because those suppliers have to report their largest customers. So we have to go through these customer segment files and to construct G. So as long as you have data where you can construct G, then you can construct a reasonable network. Of course, there are issues here that you have to be careful in terms of robustness. And then, of course, you have to put all kinds of controls. S&P 500 controls over the state of the financial sector, the yield curve controls the state of the macroeconomy, so that these things are taken into account. And there are several pieces of data where you construct a network. You, of course, we're interested in those type of corporate bonds. We have to calculate implied volatilities, and so on. We calculate the yield curve through a linear interpolation, and then from there we construct the credit spreads. This is the definition of the leverage. This is the definition of the implied volatility, which is basically the average of the near the money puts and the calls. It takes an average of the two. This is basically the slope of the volatility smile curve. And these are kind of trusted or understood measures, so there's nothing unusual here. In our case, there are about 4,400 firms that amounts to 21,000 links. But some of these firms don't trade corporate bonds, and there are a number of different types of things that you have to clean the data. But once you clean it, goes down to 150 firms. But at the time that we have studied this, the market capitalization, the entire S&P 500 is 11 trillion. In our case, I think it's about 3.5 trillion. So this is a reasonable approximation of that network. In this picture, this is the summary statistics of the data. Please just look at just these two numbers. The rest is not important at this point. For the leverage, the firm, the supplier, has a standard deviation of about 0.21. The customer has a standard deviation of about 0.22. So their standard deviations are in the same order of magnitude. When we look at the next page, this will be important. So the leverages, standard deviation to leverages are in the same order of magnitude. For the jump, implied jump measure, the firms is about this, and the customers is about this, which is half of that. So the mean jump is half. Customers is half of the suppliers. So then you control for S&P 500, state of the financial sector, you control for the state of the macroeconomy, and then you say, well, how about I put the effects of the customers? If I put this in and this, and the firm, is there room for this? Is this going to be statistically significant? If you look at the leverage, these are the robust p-values. All the p-values for the leverage and the jump are statistically significant. If you look at the leverage of a customer and the coefficient, and then you look at the leverage of the firm, remember the standard deviations from the previous page were the same order of magnitude. Therefore, the effect is almost a half. So this turns out to be significant. For the jump, remember that the mean jump was customers was half of the supplier. So given that this coefficient is almost twice as this, so they're at the same order of magnitude. So the jump of a customer is almost an equal order of magnitude as the supplier. On the other hand, the leverage turns out to be 50% importance. So this turns out to be important, but then you may say, you know what, whatever that you're presenting here, I don't really believe what you're doing because you call it a network effect, but what you're calling a network effect is some sort of a calculating average of industrial factor type of spillovers. You know, you are calling it averaging over customer characteristics, but I don't believe you. Basically, what you're doing is that you're calculating proxies for the industrial sectors. So, if you put in some industrial sector type of factors, all of your results are going to wash out, and there will be nothing left. So to do that, we put in those type of additional controls for industry and cross-industry effects. These are the French website. These are the evaluated portfolios. So these are like all the way from 12 to 48. You can think of these as if a particular firm falls into a non-durables or the oil sector or the, you know, you put them in whichever the. So once you put these portfolios, still the customer effects are there. The coefficients have not changed. The jump coefficients have not changed. The p-values have not changed. So putting the industry effects do not wash out the effects coming from the nature of those relationships that if a supplier would have its customers. So this tells us that you can put certain type of industry-specific indices to account for the nature of the relationship, but even those are going to be so aggregate so that they will wash out. You really need to pay attention to the nature of the relationship a particular supplier or a particular bank has its own customers. Can you tailor this relationship in a way that you can approximate the nature, special nature, intimate nature of that relationship, the characteristics of that relationship? If you can approximate that tailorized nature of that relationship, it turns out that that relationship is important. That relationship survives. So in that sense, this paper shows that if you're interested in a large cross-sectional set of relationships, and if there are issues where we can learn more about the nature of the relationship through identifying through certain proxies, those may be important in terms of coming up with better models of credit risk. So now I move on to the second part. This is more like a regulation. Probably this would be more like a regulation type problem. So we call this one network debt. So the problem here is that there are a set of firms or set of banks, and these set of firms or these set of banks are carrying out business with each other. And as a regulator, I am really worried that one of them is going to go. One of them is so vulnerable. But if that one goes bankrupt, or if that one defaults, I'm also worried that this particular firm is going to take a number of firms with it. But then I'm really worried that if this one particular firm is taken out of the system, how much of the system that this particular firm is going to take with it. So in this paper, what we're trying to do is that we are trying to calculate a diagnostic or a tool set to identify which one of those firms or which one of those banks is the most vulnerable one. And if that particular farm is taken out, what will be the propagation? How the network is going to dissolve once we take that farm out?